Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Leila Lewis. I'm a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist, and I am the medical director of Adventist World Radio 360 Health and the CEO and founder of Your Best Pathway to Health. It is a pleasure to have you with us here today on Level Up. Tonight's presentation you are not going to want to miss. We are going to be looking at water therapy or hydrothermal therapy and making practical applications again as we look to the past to find applications for our current situation. You know, both Pathway to Health and Adventist World Radio are Seventh-day Adventist institutions. We as Seventh-day Adventists believe in holistic health, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual healing. We believe that they can't be separated, and the science supports that. With those understandings, I am excited to invite the president of Adventist World Radio again with us today, Dr. Dwayne McKee. Dr. McKee, you have some opening remarks and prayer for us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leila. It's great to be here again, and welcome to each one of you. We are thrilled to partner with Pathways and to bring you this program. Adventist World Radio broadcasts on about 1,000 radio stations around the world, and for 50 years we've been bringing these kinds of programs, medical and Bible and family, to the world. And now as we bring this program, we hope that you will enjoy, you'll be blessed, and you'll have a happy, healthier life. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for the Bible. We thank you for giving us directions as to have a happy, healthier life. And bless us now as we study together. Bless our presenters and bless each one and supply their needs as they listen. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Dr. McKee. You know, last week we discussed oxidative stress. What is oxidative stress? Tonight we want to go a little further and talk about how oxidative stress relates to our current coronavirus or COVID-19 situation. We want to specifically look at how water therapy or hydrothermal therapy, sometimes referred to as balneotherapy, relates to this oxidative stress cycle. We also want to ask the question, we know there are certain risk factors that make it much more likely that someone is to die of COVID-19, particularly if you're over the age of 65. But now, as of Friday, they have added things like even mild obesity, pregnancy to our already increasing list of high blood pressure, cancer, and the like. We want to ask the question, does age, do some of these other risk factors necessitate we are going to have severe symptoms if we get exposed to COVID-19? Well, to answer these questions and many more, I'm excited again to introduce and welcome Dr. Zeno Charles Marcel and Dr. Mark Finley, who I prefer to refer to as Pastor Mark. Dr. Zeno is an adjunct professor at Loma Linda University. He's an internal medicine specialist, very well studied and well renowned. And Pastor Mark is an international speaker. He's also the special assistant to the president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
So let's get started. You know, I think before we can really delve into these topics, we need to make some definitions. Dr. Zeno, what is oxidative stress? What is water therapy or hydrotherapy, balneotherapy? We really can't even have a discussion until we know what these things actually are.
Okay, thank you, Leila. I'll start off with oxidative stress. Simply stated, oxidative stress is, of course, an imbalance between the oxygen molecules that are highly reactive. We call them reactive oxygen species, and the antioxidant capacity in the body, which is the things that we have to work against those species being dangerous. You see, another way of talking about it, and maybe some people have heard the term free radicals. Well, free oxygen species are free radicals. They have an uneven number of electrons, these negatively charged particles around the oxygen. Now, that's pretty technical. But what that does is that free radicals cause a chain chemical reaction in the body that easily interacts with other molecules and therefore can be damaging to other molecules and therefore organelles within the cell and then the cells themselves. Even the DNA of the cell can be damaged because of free radicals or oxygen species. reactive oxygen species. So this is something that needs to be contained, okay? And God made us in such a way that we have this potent way of damaging things, such as damaging viruses and damaging bacteria or other invaders. And at the same time, we have something that will mitigate against that or will keep it at bay so it doesn't damage everything and it doesn't get out of hand. So that balance between those two will produce homeostasis, and the imbalance in favor of these oxygen species produces oxidative stress. And there are many things that, of course, that can stimulate that to happen. You asked also about balneotherapy and hydrothermal therapy. Balneotherapy is simply bath therapy. Balneo comes from the Latin word for bath. So it's using things to bathe the body in a therapeutic sense. Going back to the Encyclopedia Britannica back in 1911, they have a whole treatise on what balneotherapeutics would look like. And I would recommend anybody who wants to know what it was thought of back in those days to take a look at that. But basically, it also includes such things as spa therapies and the use of clay and mud as part of the therapeutic regimen for helping people with various kinds of diseases. Of course, that includes water. And the water may or may not have minerals. If it has minerals added to it or naturally occurring minerals, then that's in the realm of balneotherapy. Once we look at pure water and the thermic effects of pure water, then we're talking about hydrotherapy or hydrothermal therapy. So that's the way we kind of separate those.
Thank you for that clarification, Dr. Zeno. Sometimes you see these terms kind of thrown around, and we need to make sure we have our definitions correct before we begin in a discussion. You know, Pastor Mark, speaking of hydrothermal therapy and some of these bath therapies, you're sitting in front of an unusual looking structure. What are you sitting in front of?
Well, it's a sauna. And so, Layla, we in our home try to do a lot with water therapies to build the immune system. One of the things that science is discovering, particularly in COVID-19, but in all disease, and that is the stronger your immune system, the more likely you are to resist disease, or if you get it, for it not to be as intense or to be of a shorter duration. So at least 4 times a week, maybe 5 times a week, I like to take a sauna. So I get up in the morning, and at about 6 o'clock, 6:15, turn on the sauna, and it usually takes about 20 minutes to heat. Now, I am not recommending this. I'm simply telling what I do. This is not a medical prescription. I leave the doctor to do that, you see. I'm just simply sharing what I do. So I typically take my sauna for about 40 minutes at a time. I heat it to about 150 degrees. Now, if I'm doing it that hot, what I need to do is hydrate myself. So before I go into the sauna, we're talking about water therapy and hydrotherapy. Before I go into the sauna, I take about a quart of water and drink it before going in. I take another quart with me in the sauna, so I'm constantly hydrated. In addition to that, I take ice packs. One ice pack I put on my head, and the other ice pack I typically rub my chest with because I want to stimulate, we call this vascular gymnastics. I want to stimulate the white blood cell flow in the body so that the white blood cells can flow adequately to resist disease. Now, in this particular sauna, I also have a stereo system, and so I listen to the Bible in the sauna, and I listen to Christian music. I can read for about the first 20 minutes, but after the first 20 minutes, I sweat so bad it gets all over my book, and so I got to put my book down. So that's the sauna behind me, and that's a practical illustration of what we're talking about today.
Well, thank you, Pastor Mark. We really appreciate the practical application. And it leads us to other questions. You know, Dr. Zeno, what is so special about water? I mean, we know, actually, Pastor Mark just mentioned two aspects of water. Sometimes we just focus on external treatments of water, such as balneotherapy and hydrothermal therapy, but he talked about internal treatments of water too. So we don't want to negate that very vital aspect of water. But what is so special about water? What properties does water have that makes it unique?
Well, first of all, I mean, water is just is a precious substance. If we don't have water, we're in big trouble. The body, give or take a few percentage points, is about 60% water. So if we don't have water, we're not beautiful plump grapes. We become raisins. All right, and that's not compatible with life. So we need to have water. We're constantly losing water from the body. We lose it in the urine. We lose it in the sweat. And that means that we can become dehydrated, and we need to drink adequate amounts of water, right? Now, there are some differing opinions about how much water we need to have, and we're not going to get into that per se. But basically, we recommend about 8 glasses of water per day for people who are living in what we call typical normal temperatures during the day. So that's about 2 liters, or about half a gallon of water, right? So that's easy to think about. Some people believe that you need to sip water all day, right? Others say, no, you take it first thing in the morning and you get your water intake for the day, and that's the rest. And that's what you do. What is usually not recommended is that you drink a lot of water at night before you go to bed, because what happens is that you may have to get up several times at night to let that water out. So that's an issue. Now, some of the physical properties of water that make it so special with regard to therapy is something that we call the specific heat of water. Now, it doesn't mean what is the exact temperature of water, because that's what in English it would sound like specific heat. That's what it means. But really, it means the amount of heat that is required to raise the temperature of water 1 degree Celsius, right? What it means is that we have to put a lot of energy into the water to get it to rise in temperature, right? And you see, that is very special about water, because water, if you look at all the common substances, water has the highest specific heat of all of the things that you would find around you.
Fascinating.
Fascinating, because the water stores that heat and is able then to release that heat into the body. Now, it can go in 2 ways. It can either take heat from the body by drawing the heat into itself without getting hot, or it can release that heat into the body without getting cold, you see? So water has this very special property, and that's why hydrotherapy and so on is so useful. Balneotherapy, when we use salts, we change some of that dynamic, and the specific heat of the water even goes higher when we use salts and so on in the water. So this is a very interesting and very special property of water. The other issue is that the water itself, as it changes from liquid to gas or liquid to ice or the solid form, it almost defies some of the other scientific principles. For instance, when water becomes solid as ice, instead of becoming more dense as just about every other substance does, it becomes more dense. Water actually becomes less dense, so that the ice floats in the water. So we can use ice therapeutically without freezing the system. And again, by using salts in the water, we actually can decrease the temperature at which the water will turn into ice. So you can actually use water that is super cooled on the body if we use some salts in there. So those are some of the properties of water that make it very, very, very special. God had a special idea when he made water and made us so full of it, so full of water.
Absolutely. In fact, that's exactly what I was thinking when you were speaking. What an amazing God we have, to make something like that. Pastor Mark, let's go back to Eden for just a minute. We started doing that last week. Can we talk a little bit about when and where water came into existence? Because clearly There must be a very special purpose for water.
There sure is. I should mention something that kind of triggered my mind when Dr. Zena was talking, and that is after the sauna, and we've been heated so hot inside, I then leave immediately and go through this door here into a cold shower. Now, I wouldn't want to leave the impression that after the sauna, we get up and put our clothes on because we're sweating so much. I mean, you're soaking wet after the sauna. And so the contrast between the heat and the cold, and again, I'm simply sharing what I do, not recommending this for others. You know, it's kind of a little amusing. When I first started taking the sauna like this, and we'd go to the cold, oh man, I would shiver. And I'd say, I can't take this cold. But you know, after we do it for a while, I turn the cold on as cold as it will go. And it is so refreshing. And it increases your energy. It helps to detoxify the body. It increases the flow of white blood cells. So for me, that is one of the treatments that we have used that have found helpful. Now, you talked about water in the Garden of Eden. You know, in the Bible, when you read Genesis 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's very fascinating. The word for created there is bara. And bara is the activity of God. Only God can do bara. You know, a human being can make a stool. A human being can make a house. But only God can make a tree, the material. See, so God, this bara means God is the creator. So in Genesis, what we find is that God is creating before he ever creates human beings on the sixth day of the week. He's creating all the elements that human beings need for health and for life and for happiness. So he creates light. He creates water. He creates fresh air. He creates fruits, nuts, grains, and vegetables. He creates flowers and he puts the environment, and we know how important that is for our health. So God is this bara God. He's this God who's creating all the essentials for life and health. God created a garden, but we've left that garden and we live in a jungle now. A jungle that's filled with stress and anxiety and fear. But maybe if we got back to the garden life, it would be helpful. Now, if you look at water in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, in 4 of the 7 days, it mentions water. It mentions it on the first, the second, the third, and the 5th day. It all mentions water. And it's fascinating because when you look at the creation of water and you look at God separating the firmament from the earth, the Bible makes 2 interesting statements about water. Of course, there's no rain there until the flood. But when you look at Genesis chapter 2, for example, it talks about in Genesis chapter 2, in verse 5, it talks about the plants of the field. And it says, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the earth. So here you have this external water, that the mist is coming and the land becomes luxurious and fervent because of the water. All of us have seen desert areas where there is no water. So the water serves as this life-giving force of God. Then the Bible says God creates, in verse 10, a river that has 4 different heads. 4 rivers go out. That pure crystal water was for drinking. As Dr. Zeno has so ably put it, we are about 60 to 65% water in the cells of the body. The brain is about 85% water. So if somebody says if you have water on your brain, that's a good thing, isn't it? But 85% the cells with water in the brain. So as you look at the Eden life, this pure crystal water, as we drink water, it improves circulation. As we drink water, it improves digestion. As we drink water, it helps us with our memory. There's some interesting new studies on Alzheimer's and the ability to constantly drink water and having some moderation effect. So when you look at God's creation, he has created everything for life and for health. And as we get back to the Eden life, that can help us to expand our health and improve our immune systems.
Wow. Thank you so much, Pastor Mark. Dr. Zeno, it leads me to some scientific questions. Pastor Mark made some really amazing points, and I just wanted, from a scientific perspective, to ask you, how does water therapy, balneotherapy, from a physiologic perspective, or even from a pathophysiologic perspective, how does it help us? And particularly as we're looking at COVID-19, since that's the context of what we're talking about, how would it help or potentially benefit the immune system?
Okay. Well, we can start off with looking at water's effect in hygiene. Water is essential for good hygiene. And, not everybody around the world who might be looking at this would have the possibility of having a spa at home, as Pastor Mark has, and be able to do these things. Some people have a difficult time even getting enough water for a bath. Okay, so
That's right.
We have to put things in perspective and understand that water is essential for life, and we should do everything that we can to preserve the water, the pure water that we can get, because water means life for all of us, and for people who don't have water, it is death if they don't have it. Okay,
Right.
So that being said, in the face of COVID-19, we are looking at the effects of water as it is heated up or cooled down. And, we don't have all the answers, and we need to say this. We don't have all the answers. We are pursuing lines of reasoning, and we're searching for the truth. And that's where we're heading. So on the first hand, when we talk about hydrothermal therapy and we talk about heat, we need to understand that heat actually modifies the way our immune system functions. Okay. And that modification of the immune system actually can induce some oxidative stress. Okay. If it were just left at that, heat-induced oxidative stress, you would say, why on earth would you use heat to treat anything, right? Because it's increasing this potential problem. But the way we're made, we also have an antidote, so to speak, within the system that's called heat shock proteins. And these heat shock proteins actually protect the good cells and protect things from being damaged by these reactive oxygen species that are caused by the heat therapy. So really, when we use heat, we are actually influencing the body's balance between how it's going to be causing damage and how it's going to be protecting the good cells and the good system from becoming damaged by the reactive oxygen species. Similarly, with cold therapy and the use of hot and cold appears to have a greater beneficial effect than just using one or the other. But cold therapy also modifies the way the immune system functions, and cold therapy decreases oxidative stress. So to some extent, you'll have to say you use the heat at the beginning, you use the cold afterwards. It has multiple effects that we're learning more and more about, and that's why we need to do more research to be able to understand better how it works. But at this point, we know that the combination of the two probably is what will give the most effect in terms of modifying the oxidative stress response, and also the issue of inflammation, how we deal with inflammation because of the oxidative stress.
That is an absolutely fascinating point. That the fact that we are essentially causing a little oxidative stress, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Zeno, even exercise itself, increasing the core body temperature, can increase oxidative stress. But we know exercise is beneficial to us. So it seems as though what an amazing God we have, that He created a system where we can increase one to actually ultimately benefit the whole human being. Now, I have a follow-up question to what you ask. Sometimes we focus very much on the heat aspect, and COVID-19, bringing it back to COVID-19 right now. In fact, there was a huge study that was just, actually, there was an individual who's looking at 80,000 different studies that have started since January. And this particular physician has found in their research, they're looking for cures, whether it be a vaccine or medication or etc. But what they've found, which we already know, that there's two aspects of COVID that are affecting the population. And that's where they're targeting their treatment, either in the beginning phase, which is essentially optimizing the immunity to fight off the virus, and then the latter phase, preventing the cytokine storm. How would, if you were to take hydrothermal therapy or balneotherapy and looking at the two phases, if you would, how would we say, is it potential that maybe cold treatment in the latter condition might potentially be more beneficial, and perhaps in the more preventative phase at the beginning, focusing on the heat? It's just a question that some have asked.
Okay, let me see if I can unpack that a little bit. Again, we are learning about this. We're seeing where the research is leading us, and we're also getting anecdotal reports of people who have done this and they're doing it, and they're seeing some benefits. So let me try to unpack what you were asking. At the beginning of the COVID infection, everybody would understand that what we need is the body's optimal ability to fight off that infection. All right. Now, to fight off that infection, we need to mobilize our white blood cells. We need to mobilize the innate immune system to be able to reduce the likelihood that this organism will infect and have an escalating infective rate for many cells. So if it infects one, we control that, right? So it doesn't become 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32. So we control that, okay? Now that requires an inflammatory response, okay? So we want at the beginning to have a robust inflammatory response to attack the offending agent, in this case, SARS-CoV-2, and reduce its ability to do further damage, right? But as we pass from that phase, and of course the virus itself fights against that inflammatory response, so it's fighting against us. And if it overcomes that and it goes now into its own phase, the body, in trying to respond to that, can become overzealous, okay? And we have this hyper response against the virus, okay? This hyper response against the virus is the phase in which we have the cytokine storm, right? This part of the process of that is the exaggerated outpouring of these cytokine chemicals that then bring in a lot of white blood cells. And the armamentarium of many of the white blood cells is, believe it or not, reactive oxygen species. Okay, so basically we're using free radicals and highly reactive oxygen species to then fight off the virus, and that causes collateral damage. It damages the blood vessels, it damages the tissues around it, and if it's in the lungs, it causes this severe respiratory problem that decreases the person's ability to oxygenate. It brings fluid in there. It's really damaging to the lungs, but it's not just the lungs. This is affecting all of the vascular tree. The whole body is being affected by this, okay? Now, in the beginning, because we want to mobilize the white blood cells and we want to be able to stop, that's where heat may be, intuitively, maybe a better weapon, okay? Because it will help the circulation, will increase the activity of the white blood cells, and they can get to do what they need to do in this general innate phase. But once we get into the phase of cytokine storm, now we have an issue. How do we produce an antioxidant or an anti-inflammatory response? And cold seems to help with that. And heat and cold seems to help with that, right? So So in that later phase, heat and cold may be a weapon that we can use, whereas heat at the beginning and using cold then to seal in that heat, okay, might be the mechanism in the beginning. So we're using heat and cold in both circumstances, but we're using the beneficial effect of cold later on, and we're using the beneficial effect of heat earlier on. And now, for somebody who does not have the infection, okay, what will help the immune system the best? Again, we don't have all the answers, and we want to do the research to look at this. But it seems as though the heat therapy, sealing it in with cold, so you do hot and cold showers or hot and cold, like what Pastor Mark is doing, and that may actually be preventive because it will optimize the immune system, or it could optimize the immune system. And therefore, when you come in contact, if you come in contact with that virus, you're better able to handle it without it getting into a full-blown infection. So this is the idea that we're working with right now. It will be interesting to see how things pan out, and whether we're just out to lunch, or whether this is really the mechanism or mechanisms that are involved.
Dr. Zeno, thank you so much. That is really, really informative. Now, Pastor Mark, coming back to the practical side of what Dr. Zeno has shared with us, we've talked about the sauna, and Dr. Zeno's mentioned that that's really a great phase in the preventative phase, or maybe perhaps that first category when you're trying to optimize our immunity the best we can. Of course, we want to optimize our immunity throughout the course. But tell us a little bit more. You know, there are different ways that we can use hydrothermal therapy, and you've got one there in your lap. So why don't you share a little bit with us some practical tidbits, and then I'll ask Dr. Zeno to share as well.
Thank you, Layla. You know, if you look back, for example, at the 1918 pandemic, and that killed, it's difficult to know the exact numbers, but some estimates are 50 million people. When you look at that pandemic and you look at the impact that Seventh-day Adventist sanitariums had, a sanitarium was a place of health and healing. When you look at those sanitariums, they had much lower rates of death and much more rapid rates of recovery. They used a variety of water treatments. So water treatments have been used down through the centuries, and maybe we can talk about the Romans later and some of these others. But one of the things that they did was what they called hot fomentations to the chest, and then combining that with cold, as Doctor said. They used that in our sanitariums, particularly during the Spanish flu time, during 1918 and the influenza. In that process, a hot fomentation was placed on the chest, as approximately as hot as the patient could stand it, always being careful that you never burn the patient with that. And then that was placed on the chest for usually 3 to 5 minutes. Then, after that was placed upon the chest as the person was resting, then they were given what was called a cold mitten friction. There was a cold towel that was shaped to the hand. It was cold and ice. The hot was taken off. Their chest was rubbed. That was done about 3 times initially. So the treatment lasted about 30 minutes. Then the person rested. So in those sanitariums in 1918 with the Spanish flu, in those particular sanitariums, they used rest because the person was resting. They used water on the inside. They used a plant-based diet. People were at times taken out in the sunshine in isolation. What I have here is what's called a thermophore. Now, this thermophore can be placed upon the chest. It's like the old heating pad, but it has steam in it that comes out. It is an implement that is plugged in. So here's a little cord that you plug it in. And then this is a nice little gadget because it keeps you from burning yourself. The patient would hold this down, and as he holds or she holds it down, it heats the chest. And as it heats the chest, the person can determine how long that they want to do that, so there's no danger of burning. And then as the chest becomes red and hot for about 5 minutes, you simply take this off. And if you're lying in a bed, of course, you want to have a plastic sheet or something below you, because you may get some water. And then you take a little pan of ice water beside you, rub the chest. And this kind of hydrotherapy with water on the inside, hot and cold on the outside, has been used for centuries. It's particularly helpful if, for example, I'm a public speaker speaking a lot. So let's suppose, and often I'll give very more than 200-300 lectures a year. Let's suppose I begin to get a chest congestion. Immediately upon getting that chest congestion, or if I begin to get a sore throat, I will try to drink 10 to 12 glasses of water right when I'm getting that congestion, not before I go to bed, incidentally, and not with meals. But I'll try to drink that water quite a bit in succession over a period of a couple hours. At the same time, try to get adequate rest. At the same time, use the thermophore on the chest for hot and cold treatments. I've found that to be extremely helpful to catch a cold or something early. It's much, much easier. And also this could be done for prevention. But this is one of the things that was done in those early sanitariums with hot and cold treatments. Dr. Kellogg up at Battle Creek Sanitarium, which became a world-renowned sanitarium, treated the kings and queens of Europe and some of the wealthiest people in America. They would all go to Dr. Kellogg's sanitarium. He used hot and cold quite extensively in hydrothermotherapy. And it's very, very helpful if it's done intelligently and if it's done moderately. Dr. Zeno.
Thank you, Pastor Mark. Yeah. Dr. Zeno, do you have some follow-up thoughts for us as far as the science behind some of the things that Pastor Mark has mentioned?
Well, we have to consider that that viruses, whether it's the influenza virus or the coronavirus and several other viruses, have the ability to not just infect the cells, but they use oxidative stress to facilitate their replication on the inside of the cell. So here we have what should be the defense against them. They're using it to their benefit, okay? And this virus-induced oxidative stress, so to speak, and its management by the host cell, the person who is infected, is a perfect example of how little we really may know about the harmonious balance between viruses and the host, okay? Different phases of the viral infection may have different effects, and therefore the way that the body is going to deal with this and how the body is going to tolerate this varies as the infection may be prolonged. Okay, and therefore this has led us to differentiate the way we might be treating somebody who has an early infection from someone who has a later infection, from someone who needs the intensive care unit. And therefore, it's not one size fits all. We're still looking at this evolving pattern to see what might be the best way to prevent and then what might be the best ways to treat in the various stages. Now, as a number of viruses have been shown to do this, and coronavirus is one of those, we're very much involved in looking at what the oxidative potential is for these viruses being able to proliferate. Okay. Now there are several critical antiviral signaling pathways in the body and in the cells, in our normal cells, that affect the ability of the virus to do its damage. We have things such as the toll-like receptors. I believe some people may have heard of that, like a toll gate, right? Toll-like receptors. And even interferon. I think many people have heard of the term interferon, which is something that the body produces to help fight against infections. And these help through the pathways of infection-induced oxidative stress. So oxidative stress seems to be one of the mechanisms, if not the mechanism. It is one of the major mechanisms that is involved in this. And hydrothermal therapy seems to be able to modify the effect that the oxidative stress will have on the body. And of course, oxidative stress is involved in all kinds of illnesses, including the metabolic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, even obesity. And therefore, it may be implicated that people who have oxidative stress associated with those characteristics of their life may be much more affected by the virus than those who may have none of this or lower quantities or a lower burden of these other things.
Wow. It's actually very, I dare say, beautiful to see it kind of coming together and again, we don't know. Of course, we have to understand that, but it is interesting because we do know that obesity, now mild obesity, is equivalent with being over the age of 65. At least that's what the researchers are now telling us. Being cardiovascular disease, diabetic, and all of these oxidative stress relationship chronic diseases having a direct relationship as far as risk factors for COVID-19. Now, before I ask another question as a follow-up to that, I do want to come back to you, Pastor Mark. You mentioned the Romans having utilized water treatment and balneotherapy and pool baths. How has water therapy throughout history, I dare say, been utilized? We talked about in the Garden of Eden and God's plan, and how has it been followed up throughout history?
Well, it's a great study. I've been looking at it, and the Egyptians, of course, used water treatments, the Greeks, but particularly the Romans. So let me talk to you a little bit about the Romans. If you look at the average lifespan of the Romans during the first century, you're going to find that most books are going to say 25 to 30, 25 to 35. That's because of the high incidence of infant mortality. I was looking at some studies that on Roman life. If a child lived to 5 years old, so if they didn't die before 5, the average lifespan of the Romans was 65 years old. Now that is remarkable when you consider that generation. Let me give you some examples. Augustus Caesar lived to be 75. Tiberius Caesar lived to be 77. Julius Caesar, 55. And of course, died not because of disease, but because if you avoided infant mortality and if you avoided assassination,
right.
you could do well.
You are right.
Now, the famous physician of the Romans was Galen. And Galen wrote a medical treatise that the Romans followed quite religiously. And there were two principles in that medical treatise from the first century. And I want to see if Dr. Zeno agrees with these. Principle number one, this is Galen, a healthy mind equals a healthy body. Are we okay there, Doc?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
He wasn't the first to said it, but
Principle number two. If you are fit, and I'm quoting, you can fight off disease much more easily. So
that is true too.
So it's very interesting that he understood the relationship between physical, mental, spiritual health. The Roman baths. Let me talk to you a little bit about the Roman baths. The Roman baths were huge complexes. Now, incidentally, in the public baths, some of those public baths could seat 1,500 people, and disease spread because there was too much closeness in them. But if you factor that out and you look at the true Roman baths that have some isolation in them individually, these Roman baths have 7 phases. First, you go into the changing room. Then you change into your clothing. Then you go into an exercise room and you spend time exercising your body. Then you go into an open air swimming pool in the open air with sunlight and you swim a little bit. These are all the complexes. Then you go into a dry, wet sweating room where it's either dry or wet. It's either like a sauna or a steam bath. That's the 4th phase. You can choose there. Then you go into a hot water pool that's only hot. Then you go into what they call the tepidarium, which is a tepid pool. Then you go into the frigidarium, and you know where we get the word frigidaire from? It's cold pool. And that's the Romans. And they emphasize the health of the body. Now, what did they believe? What did the Romans believe about this hydrothermal therapy? They believed 2 things about it. Three things. They believed, one, it cleansed your body. So they believed in the cleansing value of water. Secondly, they believed that it relieved inflammation and pain. And thirdly, they believed that it helped you to prevent and at times cure disease. So the Romans were very much into hydrotherapy. You got to factor out infant mortality. You got to factor out the crowded Roman baths. You know, even the slaves were allowed to use the Roman baths at a very reduced price in Rome. But there was this great emphasis on, one, of course, relaxation. They were part of the central social fabric of society. When you look at all the health benefits, open air, sunlight, but they believed certainly in the curing of disease, the relieving of pain, and cleanliness and prevention. So it's quite an interesting study. And incidentally, the Romans built hospitals for their soldiers, and they built them with hydrothermotherapy sections in the hospital because they believed that would help the soldiers coming back from battle recover the most quickly.
That's right. Maybe I can add something there.
Yes, Dr. Zeno.
Pastor Mark, that was excellent. Modern societies that have similar kinds of practices. We've talked about some of the folks in Finland and other parts of the Nordic communities. But what has come out recently was what's going on with the Japanese. And they have a bath system that is similar to the Roman baths. And the latest research looking at that shows very definitely that it's associated with a reduction of coronary artery disease. Okay, so it actually, and since coronary artery disease is an inflammatory disease as well, it is thought to be an anti-inflammatory process. In other words, something that reduces reactive oxygen species and even reactive nitrogen species, which we won't talk about today. But so what was being done with the Romans is repeated today in modern society by the societies that continue that kind of process in their thinking. The other thing that I would like to point out is that, yes, if you have a bath where everybody is sharing the water, okay, and you have lots of people sharing the water, you end up with some difficulties because you can be sharing disease, okay? And it was mainly the poor people who had to use these massive baths. They had, of course, some social interaction, which was on the good side, but then there were, microorganisms which they did not know about in the water that can cause a problem. But then if we go backwards, we would find that if they had followed some of the biblical principles all the way back in Leviticus, this probably would have been avoided because of how God speaks to his people in Leviticus about what they should do, even if you had a rash, okay? And the system of quarantine, today we have lots of people, church-going people who really want to get back to church together, and that is all well and good because of the social interaction. But God in his wisdom, all the way back in Leviticus, taught the people how to separate themselves when there is contagious disease. And quarantine actually started. The earliest records in human history of quarantine comes from the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Very, very, very good point, Dr. Zeno. I want to come back to, we were kind of alluding to it a few questions back, the relationship of oxidative stress and some of these other comorbidities, lifestyle diseases. We talked about a little bit about metabolic syndrome. I want to come back to advancing age. We have heard from the get-go, much higher rates of mortality over the age of 65 and increasing from there up every decade and every 5 years that you go up from there. Does advancing age or some of these other comorbidities, diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, cardiovascular disease, does that make it so I'm most likely, if I get COVID-19 and I'm in one of these categories, particularly I'm an elderly individual, does that mean I'm most likely going to have severe symptoms and I'm going to die? Or is there some other information for us?
Okay.
Dr. Zeno?
Well, again, we're looking at an evolving situation. We every week we have new information that's being revealed as researchers around the world are looking back at what's going on to try to predict what can happen in the future. The short answer to your question, Leila, and I think it's on everybody's minds, is that if you were to get COVID and you happen to be in one of these high-risk categories, is it a death sentence? Okay, so let me try to unpack that a little bit. When there are more free radicals in the body, and they're not kept in balance by antioxidants, from however we get an increase in the antioxidant load, the free radicals start doing damage, and they start doing damage to the fatty tissues. They start doing damage to the DNA, to the proteins. They affect our body, right? Now you add to that a virus that uses oxidative stress for its propagation, as I talked about a few minutes ago. And what you find is the perfect storm for these viruses to then proliferate without any restraint. What else is, because we have, if the immune system is already compromised, the immune system cannot act in an appropriate manner to be able to mitigate the effects. So early on in the disease, the person may have more symptoms, and later on in the disease, it may progress to the point where the person really exhausts their ability to be able to fight the infection, and they will need extra kinds of support in the hospital and intensive care unit to be able to do that. Now, when we look at that, we say, so which diseases are really heavily involved? Well, we're going to expand more and more as the idea of oxidative stress becomes more and more prominent in the researchers' minds. Okay, so diabetes we know, atherosclerosis we know, high blood pressure we know, heart disease we know. Cancer is a sleeper here, right? Why pregnancy? Well, during pregnancy, we actually experience, and you know more about this than I do, Leila, we actually have to have an anti-inflammatory environment to allow the fetus to grow unimpeded. We don't want the body attacking this foreign body called the fetus. So our immune systems are actually very delicately balanced during the time of pregnancy. And things that will cause an imbalance in the immune system there can cause problems. Okay, so we're learning more and more that these things are mediated to some extent by the oxidative stress, and we also know that oxidative stress contributes to aging. As a matter of fact, there are some studies looking at the effect of oxidative stress in producing what we call fragility in the elderly person. Okay, so I can say if you have someone who is elderly and fragile, typically in the United States, the older you get, the more comorbidities you have anyway. So somebody who is highly oxidatively stressed, that person is probably at the highest risk of dying from COVID-19. Someone who has these diseases, but who has a lifestyle that mitigates against the oxidative stress that accompanies these diseases, probably doesn't have the same degree of risk as someone who has the diseases and they're living in such a way that they're just tolerating the diseases and they're not doing anything really to combat them. We don't know if using medications of all stripe will help with the inflammation and help with the oxidative stress. We don't know that. People don't usually look at medications and prescribe them because of the effect on oxidative stress. They look at, for instance, somebody with diabetes. Will this cause your blood sugar to go down? You see, so we're using some of the markers for disease that may not be the ultimate markers for looking at the oxidative stress that might be underlying the disease. And this is part of the evolving science to be able to understand what is the ultimate cause of a particular disease process. So to answer the question to people. One, it does not mean that you have a death sentence. Okay, thank God. It doesn't mean that you have a death sentence. Does it mean that your risk is higher? Absolutely, your risk is higher. We have seen such things as people who have low vitamin D. Okay, and even though we're not talking about that in the context of hydrotherapy and whatnot, it's a simple thing. If you even think that your vitamin D levels might be low, you need to get those levels up to a more reasonable amount, because the results have shown retrospectively, right, that people who have normal vitamin D levels are less likely to die. Okay, and this is an association; it's not a cause and effect. So if you want some insurance, I would say it's easy enough to get vitamin D, whether you go outside or if you live in a place where you don't have adequate sunshine. Then use the vitamin D supplementation. And if you are darker skin and you're not exposed outside, or you may have some condition that impedes the absorption of vitamin D from the sun, then you need to use a supplement to be able to get that number up, and get yourself tested and get that up. Okay, that's easy enough to do, and it works in the antioxidant pathways. Get enough vitamin A, vitamin C, enough selenium, etc., and not ingest too much iron, because iron actually facilitates the development of these of oxidative stress. And iron, of course, much of the iron in our food we get from eating meat. So we're looking at a complex array of things, and the science is leading us down the line, but we have other influences, okay, that tell us that we should go where the truth is, because we're trying to find what that is. And COVID-19 is if you can put it this way, it's in the good sense, it's stretching us and stressing us, right, to be active and decisive in trying to find what will work, and to protect ourselves and to protect our loved ones and the people around us from this problem.
Thank you, Dr. Zeno. You know, everything that you're saying, both of you have said, has really brought me back to this beautiful picture of God and creating in the Garden of Eden these principles. Some people call them God's doctors, if you will, during the creation week, that have now we've seen in science all the way through history, and now currently in our COVID-19 situation, that even if we do have an increased risk, these things can help, God willing, mitigate that risk. You know, Pastor Mark, a lot of us, we've talked about this over and over again, a lot of us feel very uncertain. What does this mean? Where are we going? And how can we come out of this stronger, holistically stronger, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, despite what's happening around us?
Well, thank you, Layla. You know, David, writing in the Psalms, says we are fearfully and wonderfully made. The more we study science and see the exact intimate design, the intricate design in the cells, the nucleus, the protoplasm, the mitochondria of the cell, the very powerhouse of the cell. We see the cellular structure when we look at DNA, when we look at how the body functions in varying organ units, and we see the heart, the lungs, and you think of brain with its over 100 billion brain cells. We're just amazed at the creative power of God. You asked the question, where can we find certainty? I think there are a number of areas we can find certainty in. First, that the God that created us has not left us alone. The God that made us and shaped us has an intimate care for our lives, that we're not simply a blob of dust. We're not simply skin covering bones or a genetic accident, that God created us and he fashioned us and he cares for us. I think secondly, that God has a plan for our lives and that he is working out his plan for our lives. Yes, we live in a broken world. Certainly we cannot avoid all sickness. We do the best we can following nature's doctors, but we know that God has a better plan for us in the future. As a Christian, as I read scripture, I listen to the voice of Christ, for example, in John chapter 14, where Jesus says, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again." More than 1,500 times, the Bible tells us that Christ one day will return to create a new heavens and a new earth. And one day sickness and suffering and heartache will be over. That's our hope. Our hope is not that we can prevent disease forever, because the reality is every one of us will die one day unless Christ intervenes and unless he comes first. But the assurance is that there's a better day coming. There's a better world coming. He created me. He cares for me. He's with me today. But one day he's coming to take me home where there is no sickness, suffering, or disease. And that's the real hope.
Amen. Pastor Mark, can you have closing prayer for us tonight?
Sure. Father in heaven, we want to thank you for these bodies of ours, these infinitely engineering intelligences, these marvelous mechanisms that you have created. We thank you for that we have the sense that you are our creator. We thank you for the fact that you promise to be with us each moment of the day in sickness and in health, constantly guiding us, constantly instructing us to treat these bodies as your temple. And we thank you that when all is said and done, one day you're coming again for us to take us to be with you, where there is no sickness, suffering, and death. And then eventually this earth will be made over in Edenic splendor, where the sun will shine, warm the earth, where the waters will flow pure, unpolluted, where there'll be fresh air and abundant, good food for us to eat. We thank you that you have a plan designed for us in the future, and we look forward to being with you in eternity. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Zeno and Pastor Mark. This has been a very, very special program. And next week, viewers, you are not going to want to miss Level Up. We are going to take it to one level up with hydrothermal therapy. We're going to be giving demonstrations, and you're not going to want to miss out on how to practically apply hydrothermal therapy or water therapy. Until then, God bless you. Stay happy and healthy.